Hello, and welcome to the restarting of Fission's weekly video chats. So today is August 6th, and we've just had a sort of a July hiatus, which means I was heads down working on a bunch of other things and said, okay, for August, we'll get some more speakers. So Adam is with us, and I saw that he and his team are going to be releasing the Muse app. But really, he said, you know what, let's talk about not just the tool, but what it means to be thoughtful in the information age. So with that, Adam, I'll hand it over to you. Maybe introduce yourself a little bit and whatever you want to say about Muse, and take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And exactly as you said, what's more important, like all product builders, I certainly love to show the bits we've been carefully polishing and crafting over many years. But I think what's more important in this particular product is a way of working and a philosophy. And that's something that goes beyond the product. Hopefully the product is a good way to work this way. But I really believe in this approach to creativity, this approach to problem solving, thinking through things. And so that's what I want to focus on, but also give you a sweet product demo while we do it. My background is, serial entrepreneur, probably a graybeard in this industry by some standards, probably best known for starting a thing called Heroku, which is a way to deploy web applications to the cloud. And then after that, I did Ink and Switch, which is a research lab, kind of human-computer interaction research lab, where we published a bunch of papers. And then Muse is a iPad app that is a spin out of that research. So essentially one of the tracks of research we were doing around kind of future of work and how humans interact with computers is that basically tablets are interesting and underutilized. And so we asked the question of how they can be used in productive work and what it would take to sort of make a tablet into a power tool, and Muse as the output of that. And we thought it was interesting enough to see if we can turn it into a commercial product that people can use and pay for and get value out of in the real world. Actually, I would probably start here in terms of being thoughtful in the information age. Maybe I'll start with a question for the group, which is, where do you go when you want to think through a really hard problem? If you're a computer programmer, for example, you probably, apply your trade by typing code into a text editor. But a lot of times they say there's typing problems and thinking problems. The typing problems is in front of the IDE or whatever, but the thinking problems, an architectural problem or something like that, usually you do that maybe away from the computer. So I'd be curious to just quickly hear, where do you do that and what do you use? A whiteboard is one example.
I definitely would say that I go to paper or a whiteboard. I think whiteboards is one of the things that I miss most from working from home, including like the semi-persistent whiteboards in shared spaces.
Yeah, I tend to use, well, historically I was whiteboarding. I don't tend to have a lot of paper around. So whiteboarding these days though, I'm iPad only. So, and it's nice to have the infinite canvas on an iPad and be able to share it. So mainly on my iPad these days.
Yeah, I normally use a pen and a stack of paper, and I like having a lot of paper so that I can, whenever I make an errant mistake, I can toss it in the trash and grab a new sheet of paper.
Others?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in. I turn my video on too. Living in BC, we're very blessed with having beautiful forests. So I go for a walk, and I'm kind of strange because I always insisted that if it doesn't fit in my head, it's too complicated. So I don't use anything. And if I can not make sense of all of it, then I'll have to break it down more. And then try to make some notes when I get back on the computer.
Yeah, well, that's a good sampling. It matches pretty well. Part of what we did in the research lab was ethnographic research of creative professionals and trying to understand the creative process and looking for similarities, not just in a particular field like software engineering or design or architecture, but what's common across all of these. And I think we touched on both of the things here, which is one, the tools, which tend to be analog, pen and paper, whiteboard, maybe Post-it notes, that kind of thing. And then on the location side, yeah, take a walk, go to a cafe, you know, stare thoughtfully out over a setting, you know, sunset, and kind of stroke the chin, and this sort of thing. That there's something about the posture and the place that matters a lot. And then there's something about the, being away from that kind of keyboard and mouse sort of setting. I'm definitely a sketchbook person. And in fact, you know, I've got a big stack of these I've made over the years. I actually went back and I even just use these cheapy notebooks from Amazon. I don't even get like Moleskines or whatever. And I went back and tallied up my budget for notebooks, and I discovered that I spend about $75 a year just on notebooks. And I fill them very densely. I fill both pages on both sides, you know, diagrams, all that kind of thing. And also what I think David mentioned there, which is sort of the externalizing of thought. We also see that there's a bit of a split. There's a category of people that I think are slightly in the majority, but maybe 60% who are very much externalized thinkers. You need to write it down, you need to sketch it, you need to do the envelope sketch to explore an idea, to explain to someone else. And there's others who are more what I would call organics and sort of do it in their head. And maybe I'm envious of that, but I'm definitely an externalized thinker.
I feel like there's an in between there where my notes are often incomprehensible to other people, whether I type them or write them, but the act of doing them helps put them in. And I often then have to process afterwards to take this shorthand into something that might be shareable, or sometimes it's not shareable at all.
Which is interesting, because I'm almost the opposite, where for me, it's all, mostly I do most of my thinking in my head, and then it's refinement on paper or on the iPad. So.
That makes sense. And yeah, certainly at least the rough versions of things not making sense to anyone else, it's your own personal shorthand. And then there's a process by which you make it more and more comprehensible, which means at some point probably making the jump to digital. And you can imagine an end output, like a writer is the purest form of this, where they're starting with maybe a literal napkin sketch of a few ideas that doesn't make sense to anyone else, maybe a couple of bullet points you took on your phone, and then gradually that turns into a draft that you can share with others for feedback, and eventually it's published in some format that maybe anyone could potentially read and make sense of and get something from. So we saw the opportunity here as twofold. You know, I don't believe in taking an analog process and putting it on a computer just because. But what I do think is that the world has changed in terms of creativity, and that's usually what I like to call the information age, which is that creativity is as often as not an act of remix, an act of taking other ideas that you're drawing from. And I think in this, you know, world of social media and so forth, for me, Twitter is a big one, tweets, but it's also like PDFs of papers that I'm reading. It's books. I'm a huge user of Kindle and my Kindle highlights and pulling, you know, I read a whole book and then I want to like take the lessons and use that in some way. And I pull out my Kindle highlights and I want to kind of further refine and remix those and understand them. And so what we saw the opportunity here was with the iPad, which just in the iPad Pro in particular, just in the last couple of years, and particularly the stylus, which is actually relatively new, it's gotten very, very good. I actually think it's the best computer hardware ever. But at this moment, I think for a lot of people, it remains, sounds like Brooke, you're an exception, but for many people that we've spoken to, they see the potential of it as a productive and creative tool. But for many people, it turns into a way to watch Netflix on the sofa, or maybe browse through social media, which is fine uses, but I think is a severe utilization of this platform. So I think this combination of things, which is the creative process maybe benefiting from digital sources and the sort of untapped potential of the iPad, we saw that as the opportunity for Muse. So with that little preamble here, let me share my screen. I'll assume everyone can see that all right. So this is what Muse looks like. And one of the pieces of research we explored, and I think is connected to, again, the creative process and what makes a sketchbook good and what makes a whiteboard good, is it's very much a blank canvas for your thoughts. It doesn't interrupt you. It doesn't try to grab your attention. And so, in fact, actually, the first time we submitted to the App Store, we were rejected. And the reviewer said, I think there's something wrong with the app. When I run it, it's a blank white screen. And it turns out that's actually a feature. We want 100% of the content to be for the user and be able to, just like the blank page of a notebook. And then from there, you want to bring in content. So of course you can sketch, I can simply just draw on it. And that's what a lot of these kind of like sketchbook apps for the iPad that exist kind of focus on that. And that's fine, but I think it's probably not worth paying $1,000 for this fancy piece of glass just to sketch, maybe. But I think where it gets more interesting is the content, that's the digital sources. So now I can start to bring things in. So I might start, for example, photo, sort of an obvious thing. I think for a lot of people, their camera roll for me is like kind of an inbox of things I've seen and things I want to capture. It could include screenshots, for example. Another one, of course, is files. And I mentioned before, I read a lot of science papers, so that's a big one for me. So I can pull in PDFs. Here you can read through them within the tool and kind of place that. Another one, of course, is text. And so for me, I copy paste a lot of text from things like emails and Slack and so on. In this case, maybe I'll just take it from a website here, which is sort of a form of excerpting, you might say. Bring that in. And yeah, what's one more thing? Maybe, yeah, the web links are of course important, bookmarks. Go ahead and do that. So a few different types of media that's in here. And then once it's all in here, you notice that everything I bring in is sort of this card that can be moved around, resized, shuffled around. So here again, we're trying to capture that paper experience where typically, there's a lot of great PDF annotator apps out there, but they tend to give you a kind of a static list sorted by recency or something like that. And so you can come in here and annotate your stuff. We got some excerpting capabilities like this. You can sort of pull out pieces of it and then you place that card on the board and it keeps its source. But what's important here is all of these things are, all of these things are sort of parallel objects in the system. There's these cards you can arrange freely on the board, and that sort of mixed media canvas, free arrangement, no clutter on the screen. It's all your content, and then you can sort of scribble all over everything and make connections. That's sort of the core of the application. So I'll pause there for questions. Any immediate reactions?
So fast.
Well, thank you. Teeing us up. Yeah, part of that is, of course, the iPad Pro is 120 frames per second. You're not even seeing its full capability, which I think is really cool, but it's also a value for us. Speed of thought, moving fast. There's no opening a document, a spinner, waiting for the thing to come up. That it's fast, it's fluid, it's immediate all the time. You're never waiting. And we think that kind of is one of the things that's great about analog stuff. When you take a Post-it note and put it on a whiteboard, you're not waiting for the system for some spinner. It's all very immediate. We think that's important for the creative process.
How do you organize the sketches? Like, what's the way for, is it just flat file structure, or is it, can you connect?
Here you're talking about like kind of under the hood, or if as a user?
No, just not under the hood, just in general. It's like if I want to make a new sketch, but associate them in some way.
Well, you teed me right up for the next part of things, which is we use what's called a zooming interface. So here I can make a new blank board if I want, put that wherever, and then I can zoom into it. And then that becomes a place that I can put new stuff. And then I can zoom back out. And then that becomes another card that I can place in the system. And in fact, maybe I want to actually carry some of my other cards here across. That. And so I basically get this nesting. And of course, you can imagine I could put yet another one in here if I wanted to do that. And so I get this sort of infinitely nested arrangement, and that's sort of the structure.
So all visual and interactive. So are you've got that photo there? You're doing some touch gestures to control some of those things.
Yeah, so some of it's pretty obvious, and this is a place where a screen share really doesn't work. Being able to see my hands would be helpful, and actually I consider doing that. Just using that. Sometimes I've given demos with kind of a document camera. Then you can't see the screen as well, of course. But being able to see the hands is actually a big deal. And in fact, in our user handbook, we in the user handbook, we specifically do filmed filmed hands, not loading for some reason, but where, what's going on there? Because we think being able to see the interactions is important. But yeah, just to kind of briefly summarize. So moving a card is one finger, you grab a corner to resize, you pinch, sort of like Google Maps, to go in and out. Pretty, that's all pretty standard stuff. The stylus is drawing. You can pull in this little tool palette from the side if you want to access some of these things. And then we have a couple of what we call meta keys. So this is where a lot of the research in the lab was around how can we make a touch interface powerful, because most touch interfaces are based on the phone. They assume you do it with one hand. You do everything with a finger. It has to be a button on the screen. But here I've got 10 fingers and a stylus. And if we treat those as distinct inputs, we can do interesting things. So that's, for example, to draw, I just use the stylus, but to erase, I place one finger down and then I can erase. And so that doesn't require me to do any kind of toolbar, switch back and forth. I can just do it kind of pretty instantly, and that becomes muscle memory. Similarly, the selection capability, let's say I wanted to select everything here, I just hold down 2 fingers and that gives me the select tool like that.
So you're really, you're going down the Brett Victor humane representation of thought. I think I have that in our reading list on our forum, and I'll make sure to pass that. That's directionally where some of the stuff thinking is coming from.
Absolutely, yeah. We drew a lot of inspiration from the tools for thought history, which includes, and certainly Brett Victor is a modern version of that. And why aren't we using more of our natural facilities versus being very kind of restricted? We also draw a lot from the humane interface, which is Jess Raskin's book from the late 90s. The zooming interface is one specific piece that's mentioned there. So absolutely, many of those academic sources are the inspiration for this. And a big part of what we want to do with this venture is not just, even though we participated in a lot of that research ourselves, we wanted to take some of these really powerful ideas that have existed in the human-computer interaction field, in some cases for decades, they've never really made their way into commercial products. And we think that's a shame. We think that, and we felt like this was an opportunity to do that.
I would also say that, what I'm seeing and feeling is I'm a very long time Mac user, including the pre-terminal days. This makes me think of very specifically the app that I'm thinking of is OmniGraffle, which I used sort of extensively. And then as we moved everything to online and had mainly crappy web apps, we lost that, but the collaboration, because OmniGraffle didn't make the leap to collaboration.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about collaboration?
Collaboration is crucial, maybe even table stakes for useful work applications. We think that the starting place for a thinking tool has to be private, it has to be intimate, it has to be for you. And I think that's, a lot of these really great team tools, like say Notion, I think are really great on a team, and maybe they are less so for an individual. And I think that's partially because they started with the team side. And so for me, the sketchbook or the whiteboard is a very personal space. So we really wanted to, and what we're launching here in a couple of weeks is the single user application. But I also think that collaboration is crucial on teams, and it's just sort of table stakes nowadays. But you always have this, I think we see in this industry, this divide, which is you have OmniGraffle is a great example of native Mac apps. And there's lots of other great creators for the iPad and the Mac, as well as other platforms where they make these native high-speed applications. And they're just a joy to use, and they don't have spinners, and they work offline, but without that collaboration, they're inherently limited. Or then you have the Slack, Figma, Notions of the world. And these are great. Obviously, I use these tools. I even use there's a nice little kind of Figma kind of iPad bridge that I use here, and I actually use it together with Muse quite a bit. I'll drop in something that I'm working on just through the share sheet here, and then be able to bring that in and kind of mark it up a little bit, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think they're just low, they just aren't high performance and they don't feel as good. And I think that is a huge shame. And I believe it's possible to have the performance and some of the privacy benefits of the native applications combined with the collaboration capabilities. That was another track of research we did in the lab, a thing called Local First. We're very much hoping to bring that to bear when the time comes to begin work on the sharing and collaboration features. But we really wanted to get that single user experience right, fast, fluid, intimate, and then launch that, and then we can think about that next part.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how you've very much leaned into the OS level, share sheets as interchange there, which means that of course you've got this bridge to lots of places. It does also make me think, and was like related, I mean, not exactly, but partially related to David's question around under the hood. Have you given any thought to how you represent this schema-wise so that others could play and remix?
Absolutely. So at the moment, you can export as what's basically a zip file with some JSON that has the position of the objects and a bunch of flat files. One way to think of this is that it's a file browser, like Finder or Dropbox or something, but it has spatial arrangement. And so we'd love to find better ways to kind of connect to that world of file, because I love files, but they kind of haven't really made the transition very well to the modern internet and mobile era. And then there's the extensibility side of it, whether that's programmability, automation, integration with other projects, products, data interchange. We're really interested in all that. At the moment, all we have is the Muse bundle, but that's another path we are looking forward to exploring now that we've got the kind of core interactions right.
Amazing. That's great. I mean, that's very much so. Brooke and Daniel next week are going to talk about our web native file system, and our goal is to, despite various antitrust cries right now, if you actually dig around in the settings of all of Apple's, certainly all their native apps, you can change where they're stored. And if you make a native app on iOS that exposes a file interface, you can target it. So I would encourage you to implement that interface because, for example, people could then store Muse bundles on the Fission web native file system. So there are, as far as I can tell, the hooks are there. For example, I've selected Google Drive as the location to save Keynote files. The Google Drive side is atrocious and doesn't really work, which has kind of been my experience with how they implement things. But I think, I haven't seen a ton of use of it, but I'm excited that we can do some things with it.
Excellent. Well, assuming we have time, I thought the last thing I just thought I'd show you is so obviously this is a very kind of, I'm just poking some cards around just to sort of show you how mechanically this thing works. But a lot of people ask, okay, well, how does it actually work in practice? So I just grabbed a couple of boards from my recent musing, and I thought, maybe
a verb. I love it.
Indeed, yeah. I've taken to using that verb. And again, coming back to this being thoughtful and being thoughtful in the information age, we're really building this product as a way to be kind of a quiet place to disconnect while you still have access to your digital sources. But you really can do this in other ways. And I'm just as happy to see people sort of taking that way of working and either enhancing what they already do or embracing that. For example, one thing I've seen is just people printing stuff out and using that and drawing all over it and pinning stuff to the walls. You see this in design agencies and so forth. I think that's basically a musing process, and one that maybe is cheaper than buying an iPad. I'm of course a big fan of this device, and I hope we continue to make the product better. But again, it's the way of working to me is what's important. Yeah, just to give you a quick idea, again, I just grabbed these out of some recent stuff that I did. Here's one, for example, where I just was doing some mind mapping about how sort of my pieces of my career fit together. I particularly like this site 80,000 Hours that talks about how to have a good impact with your career. I grabbed some of my notes here, which sometimes end up being, you know, this is obviously just a photo of a notebook, or there's something like, screenshot of, you know, GitHub, or, you know, this is a Google Doc actually that I exported as a PDF. So it's very often the case that, you know, sort of like pulling in this weird hodgepodge of stuff. And you can even see here where, you know, you could use a piece of pen and paper and a regular sketchbook to do something like this. But for me, it adds a lot of flavor to drop in these logos of these products and companies I've worked on, because there's a lot of emotional attachment to that. And it makes it more powerful and poignant, both in the moment when I'm doing it, but also when I come back to look at it later.
Since you pulled up career and some other things, I heard a rumor that Heroku was an accident that you built while you were making a collaborative editor of some kind. Can you confirm or deny?
Accident's a strong word. Happy to briefly give the origin story there. So we got really inspired. This is another example of where sort of some academic work inspired a commercial product, which is there's a book called A Small Matter of Programming, which is a 1993 book that kind of lays out what I would now call end user programming idea, which is basically making programming tools more widely accessible for essentially non-career software engineers. And we saw that with Ruby and Rails and Agile and virtualized servers, there was potentially the capability to make kind of an all-in-one development environment that let you both build the web application and sort of press a button and have it just sort of be live on the web. And so we ended up writing, circa 2007, a little kind of editor that ran on the web. You know, nowadays you got something like GitHub Codespaces is a version of this. So it was a little editor. You could edit a Ruby on Rails app, and then you would have it sort of live. And what happened with that was we ended up pivoting because we discovered, one, the web was a little too early to do any kind of substantial programming tools, circa 2007. You could argue it's still too early today, but and then the second thing was people really loved the second part, which is just one button push to have their application live without any servers or SSH config files. So we basically extracted that part of it and turned that into the platform. So accident would be a little strong, I would go with. Yeah, it was a classic pivot, right? You start with one, you know, we're passionate about a domain. We started with one idea for a solution in that domain. That wasn't the right solution, or it wasn't the right time. But then we kind of extracted from that the real product.
Lee, are you online? Do you want to unmute yourself? I want to ask you. I feel like a lot of this interface and stuff is similar to how you work in some of your common craft stuff, including starting on whiteboards. Do you want to maybe share a little bit about how you're thinking about this and how you work?
Yeah, sure. Let's see, I can turn my video on too, just so it's a little more friendly here. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I was thinking at the beginning about how I think, and you know, I write, I've written a couple of books too, and a lot of times that starts with Post-it notes and doing the process of Post-it notes on the board. And that reminds me a bit of that as well. I think, you know, if you're familiar with Common Craft videos, were traditionally filmed on a whiteboard, and now they just are digital with a white background. But it is kind of starting at that blank slate and trying to create an experience that explains an idea through a video that usually has a voiceover. And, you know, that's a different thing than what we're discussing here, but I think there are a lot of similarities. One of the things that I was curious about as I was watching this is I noticed you drew arrows in part of your interface a little bit ago, Adam. And I wondered if you've thought about having any onboard shapes or things that kind of like flowchart sorts of things that might make that easier.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, we talked about Omni Group earlier, OmniGraffle, you know, had some of that. And some of these design tools even have shape recognition when you draw something with the stylus. There's obviously, connecting boxes together so that the boxes stay connected where they are. We've explored that a little bit, and I don't rule it out necessarily, but I think the vibe you could say we're going for is messy. So we specifically want something that doesn't feel like the computer is arranging things for you. It's like your desk. You put stuff down, it doesn't exactly quite line up. You draw a scribble, kind of stays where you put it. It's not sort of arranging or sorting things for you. Not saying there isn't necessarily places for helpers in the future or adding new tools, or certainly when we get to the day when there's maybe more extensions and that sort of thing for different use cases. Because I definitely think exactly what you're describing, the explaining use case where it needs to be a little neater and a little bit more, that maybe goes naturally with collaboration. You see that naturally leading to snap to grid and arrows that you can connect boxes and the arrows stay connected. That sort of like classic diagramming thing. But we really wanted something that felt like a whiteboard, a sketchbook, post-it notes. And I think the messiness of it is just part of creativity. And that was another thing that popped out in our user interviews, I think, was people almost feel embarrassed of that messiness sometimes. It's like, oh, my handwriting's so bad or my sketches are so bad. But that is the point. That is when you're developing the idea, not the artifact, you actually want it to be a little messy like that.
For sure. One other question, one quick question I had too, just coming from the sort of video side, I didn't notice if you did, but can you drag videos into the interface as well that are playable?
All of you are just teeing us up perfectly here. We're literally working on that this week. I think video is such an important content. Coming back to this information age, and if we say, okay, we can do better than just a digital sketchbook, we can do things that embrace the digital native. I think of this similar to, I recently read the history of PowerPoint. And at the time, the first versions of PowerPoint were a way to print out overhead transparencies. It was basically a way to produce these physical world artifacts that people use for presentations. And at some point, it actually took 10, the software had been in existence 5 or 10 years, but projectors came along, people started to realize, hey, we actually don't need to print out our transparencies. We can actually present straight from the computer. And once they started doing that, the slides could get a lot richer and a lot more, basically embrace the power of digital. And I think I see something similar here where kind of a lot of the sketchbook kind of style apps that are on the iPad now are just this transliteration of analog tools to digital. And there's benefits to that. It's more shareable, it's more searchable. I don't know, you don't get a big stack of papers in your office, but I think it's sort of minimal. And I think the real step change is going to come with digital sources. And I think video is so important. All the tacit knowledge that's shared on YouTube, being able to watch talks, take notes, that sort of thing. So now how that fits into a kind of a calm, environment like this doesn't have a lot of motion on the screen, and how you handle all that is very much a design challenge we're looking forward to tackling. But we already have a prototype that's, I'll see if I can pull it up here. Actually, I might have the alpha build that lets you just basically drop in a movie file.
And Lee, what I'm seeing a lot of is sort of there's some hackability through the standard interfaces. So if you had a folder full of Common Craft cutouts in your photos, in your iCloud drive, you could easily, from the interface that I'm seeing, drag and drop them.
Yeah. Yep. That makes sense.
So you can explain to people how they can hack the system.
Yeah. It's similar to a PowerPoint slide in that way. That any kind of visual you can just drag right in. Yeah, I'm seeing the video. That's great.
Still very rough around the edges, but yeah, we're literally working on that this week.
Yeah, cool.
So, sorry, and your version of rough around the edges is that like it wasn't like 800 frames per second or something like that? Because that looked pretty smooth to me.
One of the hardest, well, thank you. One of the hardest challenges actually in introducing new things is in many ways we're kind of making a new style of interface. Sometimes we joke and say we're trying to make Vim for tablets, which is a lot of fun and allows us to make things that are more powerful, I think, than any of the existing iPad apps, which tend to be kind of scaled up phone apps. Not always, but they tend to be very limited. You can push sort of one button at a time, and that's kind of that. Or maybe some very simple gestures. And so when you have this complex gesture vocabulary, then when you bring in something new, like, okay, we've got this media player with the video, all right, you're used to like the scrubbing controls and you can play, pause it, and you zoom in to kind of get the full screen mode, but how does that interact with all of other things when you're selecting, when you're inking, you're doing these other operations. So making that all fit together in a way that's logically coherent for the user's mental model about how the gesture system works that's what the challenge is.
That's sort of interesting. So you mentioned musing as a verb, which is great. Have you named other? Can you briefly just situate us by talking about the other objects that you think of in Muse today?
Yeah, for sure. We have our own little set of special jargon here, which is part of why we made a handbook. Mark and I actually recorded a whole podcast that was basically in defense of manuals, because what you see is in the mobile era, people expect to just download an app, try it. They don't pay attention to the tour, read a manual. Are you kidding me? We actually love manuals because it implies sort of a tool with depth, and you spend a little time to learn it, and that learning will pay off in the form of power later on. But it is actually a source of friction a little bit, that people expect that. Interestingly, they don't expect that from a desktop app, but because it's on a mobile platform, they expect, let me figure it out right away. But anyways, yeah, we have sort of a series of, so one, we would have the, is kind of the, whoops, let's do this, this guy. So this is a card. And we try to, that's sort of we're thinking of that as sort of the mobile version of a file. I mean, it is a file under the hood. When you do an export, you get the original file. Because again, I love files. Files feel very physical. But what I don't like about them is they tend to be like a small blurry thumbnail and a big file name. So here, the file name is totally optional. You can come in here and add one later. And then you get this little label. And in fact, that becomes searchable in your system, but by default, you have this thing. And so absolutely everything is a card. That includes, let's see, what did I do here? Yeah, PDF. Oops.
But the canvas itself is another object. So,
that's right. So then
okay.
the next one here is, so everything is a card, and that includes boards, but that's this next object here, which is board. That we could have called canvas, but there actually is a couple of these other these mixed media canvases, more for collaboration, like Miro and Milanote. They're not on tablet, but they kind of have a similar kind of mixed media thing that we like. And oh, my handwriting's bad. And so we call it a board. And so that's one of these things. And so yeah, you can put something here. You can actually expand it to make it wider as well. And so those can be infinitely nested. So you can do as many of those as you want. In fact, I have a pretty deep board hierarchy in my system now. We also have a few other concepts, which include the sort of the quasi mode, which again is the holding down one finger, or as well as the selection stuff. We've got the inbox, which is this little thing on the right. So actually, when you use the share sheet elsewhere in the operating system, which is a really common, I think you saw me do that with Figma. That's a really common way to share something from another application. It lands in we also have a little phone app. So if you're on the go, you snap a photo, you take a little note, you hit share to Muse, it'll kind of pop into this little inbox on the side. And part of why we do that rather than place it on the board is one of our values is the computer shouldn't move stuff around that you put there. And it's like your office, you leave stuff on the desk, you leave stuff up on the whiteboard, you go away, you come back the next day, you're upset if someone's moved it around. So we try to do a similar thing. So you get this little stash on the side, which you can also use to carry stuff around.
A quick question about, I've seen you duplicate things a few times, especially with PDFs. Yeah. Is it a copy and now they have like different histories and you can mark them up separately? Or is it, I can highlight something and in both places it's highlighted?
Yeah, excellent question. So we actually did what we called a mirror. If you read our research paper from last year where we had just a prototype of this in the lab, we did what we called a mirror, which was a reference copy. And we thought that would be really neat to have something in kind of multiple places. And as I think people have also learned with kind of references and file systems, users find that quite confusing. So what we actually found more commonly people want is the duplicate, and ultimately we'd like to offer both. But yeah, basically what we do with this one here, this duplicate is, or if you duplicate the whole bunch. So this is a set that are unrelated. So you can imagine if I come in here and draw on top of that, this duplicate doesn't get that.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to use this quite a lot for duplicating even whole boards. If I feel like I want to, I'll make it sort of a template here. Let's say I was going to work from, here's an example of kind of like a sort of a website mock-up for an article that I'm working on. But let's say I want to make some variations. And this is, again, something I love about files and file systems. It's very easy to just make a copy, go in, and you can, try some different things on that, and then come back out and be able to compare. Or if you decide that it's not quite working, throw that away. Which, by the way, you may have seen this also, but the way you delete things in here is you just throw it off the edge of the screen.
Now you're just showing off. Yeah, I think that's interesting.
There are some downsides to that, but yeah, we like that. We're trying to get some of the things we love about files and power tools on the desktop, but having some of the fluidity, fun, playfulness that you get with mobile applications. Well, we'll see if those two things actually fit together, but we think so far they do.
That's great to hear about the iPhone app as well. I think I'm probably one of the few people who has actually used the Muse app. Brooke, did you end up getting into the beta yet or not? I forget.
I don't think I've received a code yet, but okay. Even if I had, I've just been so overwhelmed.
Yeah. We're kind of busy. I think what's interesting is, your discussion about the conceptual piece and gesture piece being hard, of pushing this kind of stuff into a person's brain so that they can be effective with it is interesting, Adam, where, we're thinking along some of the same things with file systems, and thinking about the technological capabilities we have of linking back into originals and so on, but you have to do this like principle of least surprise. And it's unclear how we can do that. I've been really watching Google Drive. They have this weirdo alias thing now. Yeah. I feel really good about the deep dark hole that Dropbox and Google Drive are driving themselves in, that is leaving room for a whole new renaissance of things like Muse and things like Fission, which go black to simplicity and then grow in a different direction. I can see why they would put those things in. But this is the whole challenge of, once you have a lot of users, who are you targeting and everything else? I think that's really fascinating. I think, like, from my engineering background, I'm like, I'd like some of these objects to be linked and reflect. And I think the Rome inspired backlink is a new primitive that we're going to start seeing everywhere. I think that's something that might be really powerful in here too. Have you thought much about that?
Absolutely. So our first step there on the kind of the full linking thing is what I showed you here with the excerpts. So if you come in and take out a piece of this and save that, you get this little dot here that basically saves, sort of the context. And in fact, I can go zoom and get back to the document. So that's essentially a link. And right now we just have it for excerpts, but our plan is that this little dot here is something you'd be able to add anywhere to create a general purpose link. And you can see how that's the forward links. And then you see here with the excerpt, you get kind of a sort of a version of a backlink, and the two-directional linking, I think you're right. Rome has really set a new standard or raised the bar in a certain way. And I think that's something I'd like to see make its way into all kind of productivity applications, and certainly thinking applications like Muse.
It's coming. I mean, I think the main thing that I think that just ripped through the industry, I mean, there's sort of Trello and Kanban and drag and drop that you can kind of get as a standard UI UX component now. I think the other piece that was a app called Mailbox, it ended up getting bought by Dropbox, that pioneered snoozing emails. That put them away and said, bring them back next week or whatever, which again, now is a common pattern that's everywhere. But it was the beachhead thing that people said, oh, okay, I'm using Mailbox. It has this, nothing else has this. And then it kind of went everywhere else. And I think that's what I'm really looking for, that lets us bootstrap understanding of people where, again, you don't necessarily have to do the entire manual first. That's super interesting. When you say being thoughtful, that's tools, that's reading manuals. I mean, you're expecting more of users too, which I think is great. You're launching live with Muse, which really means it's going to be for sale on the App Store at the end of the month.
That's right, August 27th. So we're about 2.5 weeks out, just kind of teeing all that up right now and trying to get all our ducks in a row to present to the world.
And you're doing it desktop app style, where you're going to have one price, or annually, or how are you thinking about that right now?
That's right. So it's $100 a year, which is definitely a unexpectedly high price, I think, for mobile applications, where the standard has been sort of the race to the bottom stuff in the consumer app store for the iPhone. Things are ad supported, or maybe they're $5, $10. But we think that's actually something really holding back professional tools. And so we decided to come out with something a little bold, which is there's not even a monthly price. It's just sort of this one price. And we were a little nervous about that at first, but actually the beta is, you can try for free, but actually it has that paid tier. And we already have a pretty good number of customers. We've been surprised for how much it is the case for professionals that work with ideas for a living. Something that is going to help them think a little better actually is worth it, or they can justify that in the context of the work they do. Now, in the longer term, that's not I think of it a little bit like the Tesla master plan, which is started by selling the Roadster, which was, more the high-end price. And what we hope to do in the future, these early supporters, it's almost more like a Kickstarter or something. They help us because we're not venture backed. We want to kind of get the thing off the ground and built. And over time, we'll be able to introduce more pricing tiers for students and other folks that can't necessarily justify that price, monthly pricing and so forth. So that's the setup. We already have a good number of customers. We're happy about that. I'm interested to see what happens with the launch. People are screaming bloody murder, because it's this weird thing, right? Where a professional application on your desktop computer, Dropbox or a Notion or a Figma or DevonThink, yeah, of course you pay $10 a month or something like that. But once you come onto the mobile platform, people expect something different. And I think that's something that really holds back professional tools. So we'll see what the market thinks, though.
Yeah. Giri and I paid for, I guess it was a subscription that we both thought was too low. And we're like, screw that. We're going over to your Open Collect and we're adding another $50 for the year, kind of thing. Like you're not going to be able to survive. And I think that there's a movement, a zeitgeist of people saying, if we pay you, one, you stay alive and make it better. Two, I feel comfortable that me paying you means that you're not taking up all of my Shannon information theory scribbles and data mining them. So I think the timing is good. And I wonder how you think about, like, again, labeling is powerful. What do we call that? Do you want to kick off a movement or make a statement there, like you are just by doing this? But is there a label that you can maybe connect to other actions that people could get behind?
I haven't thought of that before, but giving something a name is certainly a powerful way to make it into a thing. And I think you're absolutely right. We're far from the first to realize it's not sustainable to expect that all software in the world is either made by increasing rounds of venture capital or data mining and ad supported software, or what very often happens with otherwise promising productivity tools is build it using venture money for a while, run out of money, it's not sustainable, get acquired, product gets shut down, or otherwise, goes to some unhappy place. And certainly, Basecamp has been singing this tune for a very long time, and I think we're already seeing this, right? Rome is, what is it, $15 a month, so it's $165 a year or something like that. Hey.com is $99 a year. That's basically a personal tool. you know, Dropbox has been there for a while, maybe. So it seems like that's something that is emerging. People are aware that if you don't pay for the software for yourself, you become the product. You know, it's, and so, yeah, I don't know, you should pay for software or be suspicious if you're not paying for software. That's not to say we shouldn't try to make software as affordable and as accessible as possible. We don't want to make we want to make
Tesla
something
analogy again.
Yeah, exactly. The goal, part of what's great about software is that it is possible to distribute it to the whole world. And over time, you can, if something truly useful, many people, and maybe everyone, can eventually have it and use it. But it does cost a lot of money up front to fund. And if that money doesn't come from venture capital and ads, you know, it needs to come from the customers. And I think we've seen this in the video game world with like Steam Early Access and Kickstarter. Maybe we're seeing this a little bit in the YouTube world with Patreon and that sort of thing. So maybe there's a version of that in indie software development that is, hey, please buy a subscription, because that's how you allow things like this to exist.
Yeah, also something that we're thinking about. I think we're almost at an hour, and I know you've got a beautiful Berlin evening that you need to like drink a Radler by the river. This has been really great. I'm super happy to hear that Muse bundles are JSON and your love for files, which is weird when you have this super graphical interface, but like amazing. And I'd like to commit to, we've actually got some people building sample apps right now. So if we'll talk offline, but I'd love to get the details on the JSON. And I'd love to build a little viewer app at the very least that does something interesting.
That'd be amazing.
And because it's, you know, all the things that you're saying are you know, I'll speak for myself, but I think the rest of my team is going to like be like, yes, this is what we want. This has been really, really great. So round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening and the great questions.
I will stop the recording button.